Over lockdown, while I was getting into photography, my mate was getting into motorcycles. We agreed that the next time I'm home, we're going to meet up and do like a cool motorbike photography project. Problem: I don't know how to take photos of motorbikes. So, after doing a bit of research and some practice, we ended up getting some pretty cool shots that I want to share with you today. There's varying difficulties from easy to intermediate to actually quite tricky and potentially dangerous. So try this at your own risk and I hope it's useful. In terms of location, we picked a relatively empty field because we knew that we would need an empty road to experiment on for our later shots, but more on that later. To start off with, I recommend warming up by just getting some detailed shots of the bike or car. These tips will work for any kind of vehicle. You can even do a tractor shoot. I don't know. Isolate some interesting bits of the vehicle and just play around with it and get some cool detail shots. You can then distance yourself a bit further to get the whole bike into frame. What I found when taking pictures of vehicles is that this 45-degree angle works quite well, because you can see both the side and the back of the vehicle. Also make sure you play around with height a bit. Compare these two photos. In the first one you can see I was holding my camera above the motorbike, so it's a bit of a top-down perspective, and it looks quite amateurish and not very good. By simply lowering the camera to the same level as the motorbike, in the second shot, all of a sudden it looks a lot better, even though the lighting, editing and location are completely the same. Another thing to keep in mind is that you're not pointlessly using a low aperture just for the sake of it. When taking portraits, I think a lot of us, including myself, are guilty of defaulting to the lowest possible aperture on our lenses to create that beautiful blurry background. However, when you're taking a shot of a vehicle that is actually a lot longer than the human face, you don't want there to be a shallow depth of field because you might end up with the front of the vehicle being in focus but the back being blurry. So I'd recommend sticking with apertures of 4 or higher. Once you've warmed up properly, you can start involving the driver as a model. The good thing about motorbike photography specifically is, if for whatever reason you don't want to include the face of the driver, you can simply hide it behind a helmet. Now, if you do want to involve the driver's face, and they're not super used to being in front of a camera, here are some tips that I use to make everyone a bit more comfortable. Firstly, act out some natural movements. I find this is the easiest way to caption like candid shots. For example, with my friend Michi, I just told him to repeatedly take on and put off his helmet, and I would just be taking photos in burst mode to try and get some natural looking images from it. Another thing I like doing is telling my model to look slightly past the camera to the side, just with a neutral facial expression. I think it's a lot easier for people who haven't done modeling before to just look into the distance with a neutral facial expression than looking into the camera and not really knowing what to do with their faces. And depending on the vibe of the shoot, what kind of energy you want to go for, while they're looking into the distance, you can always crack a few jokes. And who knows, maybe you can get some of those cool, candid, spontaneous, smiling shots like this one. Now for the money shots. The panning and or rolling shots. Both of these are great for capturing dynamic photos that convey a sense of movement in your image. They're both based on the same principle. You slow down your shutter speed while keeping the subject in the center while the background is moving. This way you end up with the subject in focus while the background is becoming blurry, creating that sense of movement in your image. Panning shots you can do without any additional help, whereas for rolling shots you need an extra mate to help you out. So if you're in the unfortunate position of not having any mates available to drive you around, you can stick with a panning shot. The first step is to slow down your shutter speed to around 1/15th to 1/30th of a second. You're going to have to play around with this depending on the speed of the vehicle and how steadily you can hold your hands, because the slower your shutter speed, the more likely it is that the natural handshake that you have will end up in a blurry image. For our shots I used 1/25th of a second for my shutter speed, and we were driving around 50 kilometers per hour, which is around 30 miles per hour. As you slow down the shutter speed, you'll notice the image becoming brighter. So to compensate, simply dial up the aperture until your image is properly exposed again. For the panning shot, as the bike is driving past, you want to stay with your camera in the same location, and you're panning as the motorbike is driving past, hence the name panning shot. The important thing here is that you want to pan at the same speed as the motorbike, because that way you keep the bike in the middle while everything else is moving. This is quite tricky, so it's likely to take a few attempts, so make sure you get some practice in, and you're just gonna have to keep trying till you get it right. Now, building on this idea of slowing down the shutter speed, the more advanced version of the panning shot is the rolling shot. Keep in mind you're gonna need a friend who's willing to drive you around in the back of their car with the trunk open. You're going to be sitting in the trunk while taking photos of the motorbike, and both vehicles need to be driving at the same speed so that the distance remains constant. This is obviously quite tricky to do and potentially quite dangerous, so make sure that A, you're being careful and sensible while trying this, and B, try to find a relatively empty location so that you can try this without interruptions. It's quite important to have a relatively smooth road. If it's a bumpy road, your images are going to end up a blurry mess. Similar to the panning shot, where you're panning the camera at the same speed as the moving vehicle, you want to make sure that both the car and the motorbike are moving at the same speed, so the subject remains at the same distance as the camera throughout. Note that this is likely to take a few tries, so don't expect it to work out the first time you try it. There's a lot of experimentation involved in terms of timing, speeds of both vehicles, and finding that one stretch of the road that isn't super bumpy. Okay, so when taking photos of motorbikes or cars, you can follow this routine to get a mixture of detail shots, portraits, and action shots. Now you have all the knowledge you need, so all that's left to do is go out there and try this for yourself. Remember to have fun, and a big thanks to my friends Sam and Micha who helped me out with the shoot. I hope this was helpful and you enjoyed watching as always, and I'll see you next time.
Start it up.